And as the House plans to enter a new phase of the impeachment inquiry, we're learning more today about what led up to this moment and who knew what when regarding Trump administration policy toward Ukraine. Two people with knowledge of the matter tell NBC News that the White House was alerted as early as mid-May that pressure from Rudy Giuliani and one of President Trump's ambassadors was rattling the new Ukrainian president. Joining me now is someone who has heard directly from the Ukrainian president about the pressure he was feeling from Giuliani. Connecticut Democratic Senator Chris Murphy. He met with Ukrainian President Zelensky this summer and is a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. For our viewers who might not know, Senator, will you just tell us what the president told you? Zelensky.
Well, I was in Ukraine in early September. This is after we knew that the aid had been cut off, but before we knew the extent of this quid pro quo. And I went there because as early as May, I was hearing reports from my friends in Ukraine. I've been involved in U.S.-Ukraine relations for the better part of the last 6 years. I'd been hearing from my friends in Ukraine that Zelensky was deeply concerned about these overtures he was getting from Rudy Giuliani and others to get involved in the president's personal political politics. And, you don't need really good reporting to know that a new president who has never been in elective office before, like Zelensky, would, of course, be very concerned that the president was sending over his political fixers to try to get him involved in American politics. So I was hearing that in the spring, and eventually I made it over there along with Senator Ron Johnson in early September, and I raised this issue with Zelensky. I said to him it would be very bad for Ukraine to get involved in an American election, and if he wants to do business with the United States, he should be talking to the State Department, not to the president's political lawyers. And he agreed. I mean, he gave a very strong answer back, said, I want to stay out of American elections. I want to have a above-the-board relationship with the United States. And it was only a few days later that we realized the extent of this corruption and how much pressure Zelensky actually was under.
Let me ask you about what's going on Capitol Hill. Nancy Pelosi is going to hold an impeachment inquiry vote. What do you think of that move?
Well, legally, I don't think it's necessary, and recent court decisions have confirmed the fact that the House doesn't have to take an official vote. But,
so why are they?
I mean, I don't. Well, I think you're better off if there's really no reason not to do it to answer your critics.
Then why didn't she do it 2 weeks ago when they started complaining about this?
Yeah, well, again, I don't think it's necessary. I can't answer as to why she didn't make the decision earlier. But the fact of the matter is Republicans have interestingly shifted all of their criticism onto the process because they can't really have a debate on the facts. I mean, it's now clear as day that the president was trying to trade access to the White House and American security aid for election interference. And so I think this is a critical moment as the facts are becoming pretty impossible for Republicans to refute, for Speaker Pelosi to take these process arguments off the table, which she will do with this vote on Thursday, and then Republicans will be left to decide whether they actually want to continue to defend this president's actions.
Let me ask you about the McConnell-Graham resolution that could potentially come to the floor this week, basically calling the democratic process unfair and illegal, saying the president needs to have due process. Now that Nancy Pelosi is going to be holding a vote, what does that do to that resolution?
Well, I mean, it would have been a mistake to waste time in the Senate floor debating that resolution in the first place, given that the minority has full access to these interviews. Republicans are let in the room, and there always was going to be an open process after these private interviews took place. But now that Pelosi is holding this vote, I would hope that they'll shelve this resolution. Again, I think the resolution speaks for itself. Republicans in the Senate, the only sort of way that they can answer Trump's concerns that they aren't defending him strongly enough is to complain about process, because even Republicans in the Senate, by and large, are not willing to defend what the president did. Hopefully this resolution now doesn't come before us for a debate or a vote.
Correct me if you have not been paying attention, but at some point, if impeachment gets handed over to the Senate, if the House votes to impeach, you're going to have to be a judge of the impeachment articles. You, I presume, have been paying attention to what's been going on in some of those depositions with some of that testimony, at least the stuff that's been released publicly. Can you tell me what of any of it has been significant to you?
Well, I think the scope of this corruption is just continually stunning. The fact of the matter is that there were multiple high-level officials in the State Department who were engaged in trying to get the Ukrainians to investigate and help destroy the president's political rivals. And clearly that was only in exchange, ultimately, for U.S. security assistance. So I understand that I ultimately am a juror. I understand that I don't know what the articles of impeachment are yet that might be sent to the Senate. But I've been pretty clear that the conduct that has thus far been proven, that has been testified to by Republicans and career State Department officials before the impeachment inquiry, certainly looks impeachable to me.
Senator Chris Murphy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Katie.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.